So, back in March of 2018, MrRhexx, a YouTuber who makes lore analysis and theory videos on multiple games, came up with a theory about Mhaik the Liar, a recurring character in the Elder Scrolls universe across multiple games and timelines, including the Elder Scrolls Online. The purpose of his video was to propose a true identity for Mhaik under the premise that the character functions as more than just an Easter egg, and he draws upon parts of Khajiit lore to do so. As you can probably tell by the title of this video, I have a few things to say in response to Rex's video. Now, this video will contain spoilers, I guess, so if you want to watch his video first, the link to it will be in the description. I will be covering his points pretty thoroughly, with mentions of the timestamps where he says all of these things, but if you don't want his theory of Mhaik's identity spoiled, or if you want to watch his full video for yourself, I recommend going to do so now before I get into my response. So, for those of you who have already watched the video, or are still around regardless, let's talk about Rex's theory. According to the video, Rhexx theorizes that Mhaik the Liar, if he is indeed more than just an Easter egg, could really be Lorkhaj, the Khajiiti aspect of Lorkhan, who was cursed by his siblings to walk Nirni for many phases. His evidence for this verges on three main concepts. One, that Lorkhan exists across all cultures and in many of their myths is said to be wandering the world as Mhaik does. Two, that Mhaik seemingly displays signs of having achieved Chim with all of his meta-knowledge about the world, and Chim is heavily tied to Lorkhan. And three, that Mhaik shares some similarities with how Lorkhaj is depicted in the Khajiiti creation myth. So first off, let me just say that I'm not attempting to dispute or disprove the conclusion of his theory. I think that the prospect of Mhaik being Lorkhaj is very compelling and not completely implausible. Rather, my problem is how he presents the evidence used to support his theory. In other words, a valid hypothesis based on faulty observations. As I said, he draws a lot of his information from Khajiit lore sources, primarily one lore source in particular, the words of Clan Mother Anisi, which he recites and paraphrases for the video's intro and outro. But there are other Khajiit lore sources out there, as well as other points to be made from the words of Clan Mother Anisi that I feel are overlooked. Now, I consider myself to be a Khajiit lore enthusiast. I co-run a Khajiit-oriented roleplay guild in ESO, which is focused on promoting traditional Khajiiti cultural and religious ideals. As such, I am abundantly familiar with the words of Clan Mother Anisi and many of those other lore sources that I mentioned, which I will be drawing upon for my counter-arguments. Like I mentioned before, his theory is valid, but his evidence for it is presented in an improper light with regards to how the Khajiit likely interpret their creation myth. It's like saying that 2 plus 3 equals 5 because if you multiply 2 times 3 and subtract 1, you get 5. The resulting conclusion is valid, but the logic behind it isn't. 2 times 3 minus 1 is a way to get an answer of 5, but under a different set of operations that can't be classified as addition. What I mean is that Rhexx leaves several important gaps in his explanation of the Khajiiti creation myth, leaving out obvious and important points, as well as drawing upon the mythos of other cultures that are culturally and religiously unalike to the Khajiit. This mixing of dissimilar religious contexts provides a rather skewed picture of how the Khajiit view their deities, which is what I seek to correct in this video. And yes, I am well aware that some of the points he makes could just be boiled down to differing interpretations, and I will cover that when I get to my points, but there are a few things he says that are blatantly contradicted by what it actually says in lore that I want to point out, because it could be these misinterpretations that influences differing interpretations in ways that are more unlikely for the Khajiit to view things. Let's start with the very beginning of Rhex's theory. Before he gets into his 3 points of evidence, he lays the groundwork to establish the feasibility of Mhaik being more than just an Easter egg by starting to interpret some of the concepts stated in the Khajiit creation myth. From very early on, we hear that he tends to use the names of the deities he's talking about interchangeably, often referring to Anur as Anu and Lorkhaj as Lorkhan. Now, the fact that he uses these names interchangeably and draws upon the lore sources from other cultures to make comparisons is perfectly viable. Anu and Lorcan are two figures that have some sort of manifestation in nearly every single worldview, so I'm not arguing against the fact that Lorcan has valid connections to these other cultures and mythologies. He very clearly does, but rather, I argue that Rhexx allows these views to influence his interpretation of the evidence too heavily, and that Lorcaj's role in the world's creation should be interpreted primarily from the perspective of the Khajiit specifically with regards to this particular theory. Let me give you some examples. At 237 and continuing on to about 249, Rhexx states, Anu was angry. The creation of the moons, of Azura, and of Lorcan threatened the stability of static that Anu represented, and because of that, he wanted them destroyed. Here he refers to Anu and Lorcan by their common Tamrielic names, which were derived from the Aldmer and adapted by the Imperials, the latter of whom also know Lorcan as Shezar. And again, I understand why he does this. It keeps the people who are unfamiliar with Khajiit lore on track, but it also contributes to that greater issue of letting conflicting religious worldviews influence his interpretation of Khajiit mythology. The idea that Anu was angry because Lorcan threatened stability, thus setting up a dichotomy of Anu villain, Lorcan anti-hero, is a very imperialistic sentiment. In words of Clan Mother and Isi, it doesn't say why Anur is angry. It can be inferred from the rest of the story that Anur is upset that Fadomai deceived him and tricked him into getting her pregnant again after agreeing that too many children would steal their happiness, but it never explicitly explains what that means from a philosophical standpoint. To interpret it in the way of being angry over the disruption of stasis may not be entirely wrong, but how he relates it back to Lorcaj is a bit imperceptive, as I hope my counter-argument will soon make apparent. And that's really going to be the heart of this video, explaining why the Khajiiti view of Lorcaj is actually not as positive as Rhexx, and admittedly many others, believe it to be. So, right after the previous statement that I highlighted, Rhexx says, from 250 to 256, that, for as long as any Aedra or Daedra can remember, Anu and Padome had been at war. This may be true in certain worldviews, but not in all of them, and is certainly not the case in the Khajiit creation myth. In fact, according to words of Clan Mother and Isi, they were, for a time, husband and wife, and had what sounds like a fairly happy marriage throughout the genesis of their first two litters, so clearly not always at war. Interestingly, just as a side note, the Khajiit don't actually distinguish between Aedra and Daedra in their creation story. Now, the way they split the litters up does imply some sort of subtle difference, with the Aedric equivalents belonging to the first litter and the Daedric equivalents belonging to the second litter, and yes, the Khajiit characters in-game do make references to Daedra as Daedra, but they also sometimes use the Elven or Imperial nomenclature for the deities, even the ones that are specifically named in their creation myth, which implies that, like what I supposed Rhexx is partially doing in his video, the use of such terms is meant as a cultural appropriation for those who are unfamiliar with Khajiiti religion. I want to jump ahead here to 1107 through 1115. Rhexx says, it's interesting that Azura and Padome, according to the Khajiit creation myth, say that the way to fight Anu is to be one with the moons. Which isn't the case. It can be argued that that's just his interpretation of the myth, but if you read it thoroughly, Azura never says anything about Anur whatsoever, and all Fadomai says is that the lunar lattice is meant to protect her children from Anur's anger. Neither one of them say anything about fighting back. Rhexx makes a similar claim between 1707 and 1719 that, out of any mortal shape he could take, and has, the Khajiit shape makes the most sense, since it is the Khajiit who are destined to fight Anu, Lorcan's greatest rival. Now, I agree that Lorcan, or Lorcaj, taking the form of a Khajiit makes the most sense, but for much different reasons, which I'll explain later. Again, the text doesn't actually say that the Khajiit are destined to fight Anu. It mentions that the Khajiit must set Master and Secunda back in their places if they fail, but only that they must hide their nature from the children of Anur, not fight him. Now, that last bit about the children of Anur is up for interpretation, and I'll get to that a bit later too, but what seems fairly obvious to me is that there is no mention of fighting Anur, but rather protecting the world from his rage. And whether you subscribe to the idea that the best defense is a good offense or not, the fact remains that these are two fundamentally different concepts. The last few contradictory statements that I want to cover before I transition into how his interpretations of the Khajiit creation myth could be refined occur at 416 through 424 and 933 through 948. At 416, MrRhexx tells us that the heart was also a creation of Padome, it had a name, and its name was Namira. Not quite so. First of all, the Khajiit creation myth doesn't mention anything about Fadomai creating his heart, just that she gives birth to Lorkhaj himself. Secondly, and more importantly, the heart itself is not named Namira. Namira is the name of the Great Darkness, which existed before the birth of Lorkhaj and which infused his heart after he was born. It was his birth within the Great Darkness that gave Namira its name, not the infusion of his heart with the Great Darkness. Similarly, at 933, MrRhexx says, the Khajiit creation myth very explicitly says that the heart of Lorkhan is an entity by itself. They mention that the heart is one thing and that Lorkhan is another. In fact, they say that the darkness inside of him and became his heart was Namira. He seems to suggest with these statements that the heart of Lorkhaj itself is Namira. Now, I have never interpreted the text that way, but I can see how one might come to that conclusion. However, there's another lore source that I think negates the need for interpretation by making it very clear that Lorkhaj, Namira, and his heart are all separate entities. In the book Littermates of Darkness, it says, when bent cats die, their souls are dragged down by Namira into the dark behind the world to serve the heart of Lorkhaj until their tails are straight. This statement implies that the heart is separate from Namira, and that Namira, like Nirni, is both a realm and an entity within that realm, the Great Darkness, although in this case the realm existed before the named entity. Now, MrRhexx does follow up the statement at this timestamp by saying that there are many interpretations of this, but I think that the sources directly related to Khajiit lore, at least, make it clear that Namira is an entity unto itself. What Namira has to do with Lorkhaj's heart is more of a corruption than a possession or a melding, from what we're actually told, which also ties into what we know of Namira from other depictions, where she very clearly has her own form and is heavily tied to the concepts of darkness, decay, and disease. And this notion ties in heavily to my interpretations of the lore, which I will now get into. So, as we move from discussing the gaps in the information MrRhexx provides to how those gaps might influence his interpretations of Khajiiti religion, I feel the need to point out, once again, that I am not calling the conclusion of MrRhexx's theory wrong. He actually has me fairly convinced at this point that Maik could very well be Lorkhaj. It's just that, as a Khajiit lore enthusiast who has spent hours and hours researching, discussing, and debating Khajiit lore with other lorehounds, I found his arrival at that conclusion to be rather incomplete. So let me explain. One thing that is very conspicuously absent from MrRhexx's theory is the mention of the Dromathra, the anti-Khajiit, their eternal spiritual enemies, and Lorkhaj's connection to them through his heart. The Dromathra are a fairly obscure yet crucially relevant part of Khajiiti culture, and I use the word culture as opposed to religion because, unlike many parts of faith, which are enigmatic and require a fair bit of interpretation, the Dromathra are very real. They are essentially boogeymen or demonic figures whose manifestations in the mortal world are both possible and imminently destructive, to everyone but especially to the Khajiit. In order to illustrate these notions, let's take another look at the Littermates of Darkness lorebook. The text is divided into 4 sections based on the main lunar periods. Under the full section it says, "These then become the dancers in the darks, where they whirl to no music but the beating of the heart. Sometimes these dancers seep up through the cracks in Nirni to the moonlit world and walk among us as if made of moonless night. Then we call them Dromathra, and this is a name of fear. For a true cat to see a Dromothra do the bent dance is to feel his tail twitch in time and feel the pull of the darks. As each twitch pulls the true cat further from the moon's light, the cat's shadow grows longer and more bent. And if the tide of the darks grows greater than the tide of the lights, the true cat is lost and becomes a bent cat. Then comes the true peril, for a Dromothra can twist out a bent cat's soul and send it through the cracks to the darks. Once it hears the beating of the heart, it too will dance bent. It is hard to stop. One night all the villagers of Lorne were found dancing the bent dance. Now we do not go there. Very clearly, the Dromothra are of real and terrible concern to the Khajiit, and the connection of the Dromothra to Lorkhaj and Namira is highly evident and should not be written off or overlooked. In fact, I don't think that the threat that Lorkhaj, Namira, and their minions pose is possible to be overstated. Now, to give some validation to Rhexx's evidence, he does make the distinction between the heart of Lorkhaj and Lorkhaj himself, which the lore books also do. But Rhexx seems to imply that the corruption was all in Lorkhaj's heart and not in Lorkhaj himself. However, I don't think that totally absolves Lorkhaj of the guilt. He may have had his corrupted heart removed, and it may have possibly been influencing his mind or his soul, but he's still Lorkhaj. It's very likely that the corruption either still lingers in what remains of him, or that it merely exacerbated tendencies that were already within him. He is the child of a deity who deceived her husband into making more children against his wishes, after all. And some Khajiit might still revere Lorkhaj for his deception and his involvement in the world's creation, but I feel that it's safe to say that many would likely consider him as some sort of demon figure. In fact, the dialogue from the opening of the Maw of Lorkhaj trial makes it pretty apparent that Lorkhaj, whether or not he and his heart are separate entities, is still regarded as an evil being. Listen to what it says.
There is a sickness here. Namira's dark litter, the Dromothra, have taken the temple. These are the only survivors. Most are half mad. It's the Zaja Lorkhaj, the bent dance. The rhythm beats the mind like a kettle drum. Difficult to watch, yes? You will lend a claw? Moons bless you, Walker. The only way to drive out the Dromothra is to sanctify the seals scattered throughout the temple. It is a long walk, full of bent cats. But if you clear the way, I can sing the beasts back to Lorkhaj.
The Zaja Lorkhaj, the bent dance. Adara High mentions singing the Dromothra back to Lorkhaj. The trial is called the Maw of Lorkhaj. 3 wicked references to Lorkhaj with only one vaguely relating to his heart. All of this implies, in my opinion, that Lorkhaj, while separated from his heart, is still corrupt and seeks to corrupt, and perhaps that he even still has some measure of control over or connection with his removed heart. In Rhexx's third point, which starts at 1755 and lasts until 1824, a rather short point, Rhexx compares the phrase where Lorkhaj's siblings punish him and say, "We curse you, noisy Lorkhaj, to walk Nirni for many phases," to how Maik the liar is extremely talkative and perhaps noisy, which is a fun comparison and could indeed be a connection between the two, but I don't think that this is the primary meaning of the quote. As I've just explained, Rhexx conveniently leaves out the most damning piece of evidence for Lorkhaj being seen as any sort of hero to the Khajiit, the fact that his heartbeat lures and corrupts those who listen to it over long, and that is the noise that they are most likely referring to in that quote from the creation myth, the noise of his corrupting heartbeat. In any case, introducing the Dromothra into the equation changes the picture quite a bit, but as I move into the discussion of my own personal theories and speculations on this matter, there is one more deity that I want you to be particularly aware of moving forward: Nirni. Towards the end of his second point, starting around 1719, Rhexx makes several claims about the relationship between Lorkhaj and Nirni. He says, "I would also like to point out that, for the most part, all the gods hate Lorkhan for what he did. There is, however, only one that has forgiven him, Nirn, what became the planet." Which is true as far as the Khajiiti worldview is concerned. Rhexx then goes on to say, at 1735, she was forever grateful to Lorkhan for having created this existence, a place for her children to grow and live. And this, again, is a perfect summary of what it says in Words of Clan Mother Anisi. Lorkhaj granted Nirni the ability to produce children, and thus she forgave him for his cruel deception. Why then am I highlighting these particular quotes? Well, let's try to put Rex's argument at the end of his second point of evidence into a simple statement. What he seems to be suggesting is that since Lorkhaj granted Nirni the ability to make children, Nirni in return granted Lorkhaj the ability to be protected from the other gods, as well as to be able to protect her children from Anur, which is why it makes sense for Lorkhaj to take the form of a Khajiit as a mortal aspect. Now, let's look back at the Words of Clan Mother Anisi lorebook. As I said before, there were portions of the story that were omitted or overlooked in Rex's video, and this is perhaps the most important of those parts. When Fadomai is imparting her secrets to Azura, she says something very prophetic just before she dies. To quote from the book, "And Fadomai said, 'The Khajiit must be the best survivors, for Nirni will be jealous, and she will make the sands harsh and the forests unforgiving, and the Khajiit will always be hungry and at war with Nirni.' And with these words, Fadomai died." Let's go over that again. "The Khajiit must be the best survivors, for Nirni will be jealous, and she will make the sands harsh and the forests unforgiving, and the Khajiit will always be hungry and at war with Nirni." Nirni isn't the motherly protector of the Khajiit, she's their enemy. Rex makes multiple mentions of the Khajiit fighting back against Anur, which it doesn't say in the myth, yet leaves out the very crucial detail that the Khajiit are always to be at war with the goddess who birthed them, the same goddess, as it so happens, who was the only one to forgive Lorkhaj, one of the beings tied to the eternal spiritual enemies of the Khajiit, the Dromothra. So here's my interpretation. If the Khajiit are supposed to be at war with Nirni, which it says clearly in the Words of Clan Mother Anisi that they are, and Nirni is the apologist of Lorkhaj and is effectively his ally, doesn't that make the Khajiit at war with Lorkhaj too? It follows the logic of the friend of my enemy is also my enemy. At 442 through 458, Rex tells us that Azura, knowing the 3 secrets of Padome, used them as gifts to the newly arrived children. The secrets were tied to the moons, as they were the defense mechanism to protect everything against Anu, the one who wished to destroy everything. But Anu isn't the only one who seeks some sort of destruction. From what we've discussed so far about the Dromothra, Lorkhaj also wishes to see the Khajiit corrupted, turned to bent cats, and dragged down by Namira into the Great Darkness to serve his heart. The lorebook Varieties of Faith in the Empire denotes Lorkhaj as the Moon Beast. A prayer titled Mantra of Expulsion, found in the starting area of the Maw of Lorkhaj trial, features the words Ghost Moon, be gone, which is a clear reference to Lorkhaj himself, who is also referred to as the Dead Moon in the lorebook The Mooncats and Their Dance. I interpret these depictions of Lorkhaj to imply that he bears some sort of threat to the moons, or perhaps is even a sort of anti-moon. The latter motion is partially corroborated by 2 different sources, the previously mentioned book, The Mooncats and Their Dance, and the Pocket Guide to the Empire, 1st edition, The Elsewhere Confederacy. In the first book we are told, "When Lorkhaj made a place for Nirni's children, the darkness in his heart made it also a prison. So his heart was cut out and buried deep in Nirni, and his body was hurled to the moons, but could not pass them, for it did not know the first secret. Thus is his body the dead moon in the lunar lattice." The Pocket Guide doesn't give us a whole lot of information on this topic, but it does make a passing reference to a legend that a third moon appears in the sky during the lunar alignment under which a Mane can be born. The Mane is the spiritual leader of the Khajiit, for those who don't know. So, we've seen how Lorkhaj's heart is able to corrupt the Khajiit and make them vulnerable to Namira. And we also learn from Littermates of Darkness that the moon's light serves as a defense mechanism against the Dromothra. In the final section of the book, it states, "To banish the Dromothra there are 2 ways, the way of Joan and the way of Jode. Warriors use the way of Joan, which is to unsheathe the claws and strike the darkness until it is no more. And this way is a good way, for everyone who is strong of heart and claw can use it. Priests use the way of Jode, which is to bathe the moonless dark in bright lunar light. And this way is a better way, for bent spirits thus banished do not return." If Lorkhaj, the moon beast, can find a way to harm the moons, or to break himself free of the lattice, or even undo the lattice, then the Khajiit are at the mercy of Namira. Their eternal struggle becomes one of constant battle against the Darks. Mortal warriors tire and age and die, and will eventually fall to a tide of immortal beings who can no longer be banished permanently by the light of Joan and Jode. Namira would eventually win. Azura's decision to keep the secret from both Anur and Lorkhaj was, I argue, not to keep Lorkhaj safe from Anur, but to keep the moons safe from Lorkhaj. Remember when I said that the line, "the Khajiit must be the best deceivers, for they must always hide their nature from the children of Anur," was tricky to interpret? Well, let's talk about why. First, we need to ask the question, who exactly are the children of Anur? At 1141, Rhexx says, when talking about Lorkhan, that he must always be changing because that is his defense mechanism against Anu and his children, or more specifically, someone like Auriel, who seeks to kill him. And this is where the lore gets confusing and convoluted, and is why I said that if you're going to compare Lorkhan's roles in the other creation myths as they relate to the Khajiit, you have to do it from the perspectives of the cultures whose religious ideals align more closely with those of the Khajiit. You see, the Khajiit have their own version of Auriel, Alkosh, and while the name is more similar in appearance to the Imperial Akatosh, Alkosh, I argue, bears much more in common with the Aldmeri Auriel. Legends say that Auriel both fought against and defended against Lorkhan and his legions, aided by spirits such as Trinimac. Alkosh, similarly, once defended the Khajiit against a possible manifestation of Shor, aka Lorkhan. What I am referring to, of course, are the massacres of Pelennor Whitestrake, who, early in the First Era, led a series of pogroms, another word for holocausts, against the Aelids. Pelennor Whitestrake was purportedly a Shezarene, or possibly a group of similar Shezarines, which are basically avatars who may be infused with Lorkhan's essence or else bear some sort of connections to him. Pelennor was known to lapse into fits of homicidal madness, in which his killing became indiscriminate. According to varieties of faith in the Empire, Alkosh is said to have repelled Pelennor during one of these holocausts, which supposedly was mistakenly targeted at the Khajiit. However, it's actually a personal theory of mine that Pellennor's attack on the Khajiit was not mistaken, but rather purposeful, given Pellennor's likelihood of being a Shezarene, and we've already established how Lorkhaj, both logically and lore-wise, is not an ally of the Khajiit, but a dire enemy. And though the lore article on Pelennor says that he killed indiscriminately, only two races are cited as being targets of Pellennor's larger massacres, the Aelids and the Khajiit, the latter of whom is said to revile him because of it. And sure, it's easy enough for people who dislike the descendants of the Aldmer to say stuff like, well, elves are evil, they love Anu and just want to destroy all of existence, blah blah blah, Lorkhan's going to team up with the Khajiit and beat those children of Anu back because elves are stupid and evil and deserve what's come to them, yada yada, okay good. But what is it actually saying in the Khajiit mythology? It's saying that the Khajiit are at war with Nirni. Why? Because Nirni is jealous that Azura was told Fadomai's secrets, which were her actual greatest gifts. And what did Nirni do? She decided to spite Azura's chosen people, the Khajiit, because Yifer revealed the first secret to Nirni, thus prompting her jealousy. And from the beginning, Nirni and Azura fought for their mother's favor. Azura was the favorite daughter. Azura was the one who gave the Khajiit their forms. Nirni not only forgave the deity who tricked many of her siblings into dying, but, to spite her still living sister, she made her own realm as hellish for the Khajiit as she could. Nirni might be protecting some of her children, the Bosmer perhaps, which are cited as her favorite children, or maybe any of the other races, but if anything, she's letting Lorkhaj walk all over the Khajiit, perhaps literally if Rhexx's theory holds true, and giving him easier access to corrupting them with Namira's darkness. And I know I've brought this line up a few times already, but it really is pivotal. And the Khajiit will always be hungry and at war with Nirni. What other groups of people does that sound like? The Ancient Aldmer, perhaps? maybe even the Fourth Era Thalmor, if I might be so bold, at war with creation itself and the Mundus, of which Nirn is the hub. The Altmer and the Khajiit generally team up and help each other throughout history, regardless of how one race views the other. It was the Altmer who aided the Khajiit during the Nahatan Flu. It was the Altmer who helped restore the moons to the sky during the Void Nights, thus solidifying another alliance with the Khajiit. Now, you anti-Altmer conspiracy theorists out there might argue that it was all a trick, just a setup by the Altmer to manipulate and use the Khajiit. I attest that it's not, at least not completely, but if it is, why? Why the Khajiit in particular? They're not a dumb or gullible people. In fact, the lore paints them as being one of the cleverest races in all of Tamriel. So why, if all of these instances of Altmer aiding the Khajiit are just ruses, are the Altmer trying so hard to sway the Khajiit to their side? Well, this is where we enter the realm of pure speculation of my own, but I would say that it's, at least in part, because they share a common enemy, Lorkhaj. Now, there are a few other cultures who view Lorkhaj in a more negative light. As Rex points out, the Okudans have their views on Sep as being a hungry snake who can only slink around in a dead skin, trying jealously to eat the stars. But the Altmer and the Khajiit have a particular commonality with regards to this deity. In Aldmeris, Lorkhan translates to Doom Drum. Drum, like something that produces beats that people dance to? Like a heartbeat, perhaps? Like the beat of Lorkhaj's heart, which sways Khajiit to dance the bent dance, thus serving the heart? The Dromothra dance to no music but the beating heart of Lorkhaj. It is a song without song, dark and seductive. The heartbeat is a lie that repeats and repeats until it becomes truth to the cat who hears it. When a Khajiit accepts the will of Lorkhaj as truth, they forget the riddle Thar and become lost cats. Khajiit that are well and truly bent cannot be saved through song. They can only be banished with knives and moonlight. Adara High even says in the first bit of information she tells you about the Maw of Lorkhaj that the rhythm beats the mind like a kettle drum, further solidifying the connections between the views of the Khajiit and the views of the Aldmer regarding this particular deity. So, who exactly are the children of Anor? I honestly have no idea. If the words of Clan Mother Anisi Lorebook is anything to go by, then the fact that Anor specifically is the one who names Alkosh might indicate that Alkosh, and possibly the rest of the First Litter, although it doesn't explicitly state it, are his children. But as we've already discussed, Alkosh is actually seen as a hero amongst the Khajiit. The most obvious and imperialistic interpretation, like Rex made in his video, is that it refers to the elves and their gods, more specifically the Altmer, who are seen numerous times actively attempting to resist change. They are purportedly the most semblant race to the ancient Aldmer, unless you happen to believe the claims of the Maormer, and they often pride themselves on their longevity, perfection, and divine ancestry. But here's the thing, even the Psijic Order, the Altmer who are so adherent to the old ways that they formed a reclusive monastic society dedicated to preserving their ancestral ideals, even the people who literally removed their island headquarters from Nirn at several points in history to keep themselves impregnably isolated, even they are connected with this following quote from the lorebook The Old Ways, in which the sage Taherite is quoted as saying, "In Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin. It is the duty of the disciplined Psijic to dilute change where it brings greed, gluttony, sloth, ignorance, prejudice, cruelty, and to encourage change where it brings excellence, beauty, happiness, and enlightenment." The quote further discusses being careful not to instigate Ognathir, or bad change, and that the forces must be in balance. But rather strikingly, this is a very open-minded quote from a people who are often considered to be shallow and oppressive by most of Tamriel, even if the Psijic Order happens to be a bit more accepting of people from other cultures, as their appearance in ESO indicates. It's not like they're taking in people at random and letting them waltz around the island. They are very selective about who can actually become a member of the Order. But what's the point, right? Where is all of this going? The Khajiit creation myth doesn't say that the Khajiit are destined to fight Anur, and it never explicitly states anywhere that stasis is evil. The Khajiit value change and adaptation, but not for the mere sake of change itself. They come in different forms because Azura crafted one for every purpose. As a people, they are diverse and adaptive, but as individuals, they are bound by the lunar lattice into their forms. In fact, we see just how incorruptible a Khajiit's form is supposed to be from a question that was addressed in a really great publication from the Lore Master's archive titled Moon Bishop Hunal Answers Your Questions. For those who don't know, the Lore Master's archive is a series created by ZeniMax in tandem with the release of The Elder Scrolls Online, which focuses on revealing new lore books or providing in-character Q&As between lorehounds and canonical lore figures, for the purpose of elucidating the more obscure or complicated points of lore. One of the questions posed to Moon Bishop Hunal inquires about the connection between Khajiit and werewolves, as both groups are heavily linked to the moons. Hunal replies with the following: "Every Khajiiti hunter respects Lord Hircine, and what true cat is not a hunter at times? But not all the Hungry Cat's gifts are proper for true cats to accept. The lunar lattice grants Khajiiti their skins, and to change those skins for others is impermissible. This one considers the werewolves' worship of the moons a parody of the true lunar faith." Doesn't lycanthropy then sound a bit like the Khajiit concept of Ognathir? Bad change? I know we've sort of diverged from the matter at hand, but my point is that even if the Altmer are included in Fadomai's warning about hiding one's true nature from the children of Anur, that doesn't make them enemies. It just means that the Khajiit must be cautious and defensive around them, and in fact, the Khajiit often display such caution and aloofness to nearly everyone of every other race of people they interact with. As we've seen multiple times throughout Elder Scrolls history, the Khajiit and the Altmer find ways to work together, often in a mutually beneficial agreement, no matter how lopsided those agreements may seem. At least it's not the Empire that just conquers people and expects everyone to be okay with their rule. Even when they, ban the trade of moon sugar in the Third Era under the Septim regime, but ultimately, if you want to know why Lorkhaj makes sense as the secret identity of Mike the Liar, but why that actually isn't a good thing for the Khajiit, look at Lorkhaj from the perspectives of the cultures whose outlook on their version of him is as grim as the Khajiit's. Look at the Khajiit view on its own. Look at the Yokudans and Sep. Look at the Aldmer and the Doomdrum. I mean, if you really think about it, there's a lot to suggest a much deeper connection between the Aldmeri races and the Khajiit. It's even possible to interpret the Khajiit creation myth in a way that suggests that the Khajiit believe that, in some sense, they are the descendants of their gods as well. Don't believe me? Think of it like this. Nirni isn't just the planet, she's the spirit who was given a plane by Lorkhaj in which to birth the peoples of Nirn. Fadomai literally gives the gift of birth to Nirni so that Nirni, a goddess, can have her own children. When Azura and Yifer were allowed to make changes to the Khajiit and Bosmer respectively, the myth says that, from that moment, they were no longer in the same litter as the Khajiit. Anur and Fadomai gave birth to 3 litters of gods, and now that term litter is being used again here. Even if it's just one particular ancestor as opposed to many, the Khajiit creation myth still hints at some idea of direct descent from a higher power. And even if you don't want to go so far as to interpret their creation myth in that way, the important thing to take away from all of this is that if you want to use the relationships between cultures and their religions to prove a point of interconnectedness, pick cultural interpretations that are actually thematically similar to each other rather than fundamentally opposed. Anyway, I think I'm starting to ramble, so let me wrap this up with a few final thoughts. Lorkhaj, Lorkhan, however you want to say it, the fact of the matter is that he is not seen as a hero figure in every culture, and trying to understand his role in the Khajiiti pantheon from a heroic perspective is, at best, an incomplete picture, and at worst, a major flaw in the interpretation of the Khajiiti worldview. If Maik is actually Lorkhaj, that has terrifying implications for the Khajiit. It means that the one responsible for controlling the Dromathra, the one whose heartbeat can legitimately corrupt souls, is walking amongst them, a husk in mortal disguise, who can look like them and sound like them, and who could easily persuade them to follow him until the beating of his heart starts to fill their ears and twist their tails. Is Mike the Liar helping mortals to achieve Chin, or is he sharing what he knows in the hopes that a particularly gullible Khajiit will happen along who, in return, will speak the secret that allows the Moon Beast to carry out his service to Namira? I'll leave that for you to decide. So that about covers the points I wanted to address from MrRhexx's video, along with a few of my own ideas to add to the discussion. Obviously, with how deep and interconnected most of the Elder Scrolls lore is, I could spend hours chasing every line of thought into some other connected topic and circle back again, only to arrive at different interpretations, which is almost what happened here. The important thing to remember is that it's all meant to be a friendly conversation for fun that allows us to gain a better understanding of a fictional world that many of us nonetheless relate to on a deeper level. So no, this is not going to become a regular thing. I'm not going to start ripping apart other YouTubers' theories and try to pretend that I know more than they do, and that's not what I'm doing here either. This is just one area of the Elder Scrolls lore that I happen to have delved so deeply into that it's difficult for me to see misinformation spread. And I highly respect Rhexx as a YouTuber and a theorist, and I don't believe for a second that he intended to give an incomplete picture of the Khajiiti worldview. I think it's just a matter of the Khajiit having a surprisingly deep lore with an agonizingly small and obscure number of legitimate references that it's easy for some of these details to slip through the cracks. So, Rhexx, if you are watching this, I hope you don't take it the wrong way. Fans of Rhexx, if you're watching this, know that I'm not trying to tear him down or doing this out of any false sense of superiority. I'm just trying to input my knowledge and my perspective on the matter for a more comprehensive picture of Khajiiti culture and religion, for the benefit of those who actually happen to care about it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, especially if you've made it this far. If you have anything to add to the conversation or any points of mine that you would like to refute, please do so respectfully. If you want to view all of the sources I referenced in the video, the links to them will be in the description below. The UESP site has many great sources for understanding the lore of the Elder Scrolls universe. I don't think it should be any great secret where I came across all of this knowledge, so I definitely recommend perusing them at your own discretion, especially if you are an aspiring roleplayer. Keep in mind that the ones at the very bottom are not strictly lore, they are merely the best attempts by the writers of the articles to make sense of and summarize all of the deep and often conflicting lore we are given on these particular topics, though they do contain references to the original lore sources. With all of that said, I will take my leave, and until next time, say farewell. Eagles advance.